Thank you for the intro. Some of you might already know that we have been working on the herbicide resistant project, but just to kind of refresh, we'll start with our focusing question, which is, despite agriculture advancements, why is the evolution of herbicide resistance outpacing human innovation? So in order to answer that, we have come up with this outline in order to answer our focusing question. So we'll be discussing about herbicide resistance, followed by iceberg, some of the events, trends or patterns, and the structure itself. And then Chris will be talking about the model and the result section. And then we have our conclusions of what we think is reinforcing our problem. And we have questions towards the end. So herbicide resistance. Herbicide resistance is the inherent genetical ability of the plant species to survive a herbicide application to which the original population is susceptible under same dosage and growing conditions. So the other definition is also pretty much the same thing. What it uh, what it tries to explain us is, so if you have like, let's say for example 10 weeds in a plot and you go and spray herbicide, there might be one or two weeds which might not die, and those weeds would be producing seeds and passing on the traits that they already had in them for the herbicide resistance onto the next generations. So this definitely doesn't happen in one or two generations. It takes time, but that's what happening in the background. So for this, so the two important terms here are, this resistance is driven by selection pressure and it doesn't entail any genetic changes. So what we mean by selection pressure is, whenever we are applying herbicides, we are killing a part of the weed population, and the rest of the weed population survives because of the inherent genetic ability they had in them, and they would be passing on their traits to the next generation or offsprings. So we are not inducing any genetic changes in the plant. So it's just there in the plant because of the natural selection. What we are doing though is increasing that selection pressure and reducing the time, which might take like 10 or 15 years for the weed to develop resistance, and reducing it to maybe like 4 or 5 years because of the things that we are doing. There are like different types of herbicide resistance, but we are only discussing about the chemical induced herbicide resistance. For example, like the other types of resistance can be like, if you're walking through a field and you find a weed and you pull it out, even in that case, you are kind of creating a selection pressure, but that pressure that you're creating by physically removing the weeds is very less compared to when you kill those weeds applying the herbicides. Moving on to the next slide, here are some of the recent events. So you might have already seen this slide in our earlier presentation, but we want to include this to emphasize how much herbicide resistance is important. Moving on to some of the trends. So this graph represents the number of unique global weed resistant cases. So if you look at the graph, they have been like very less or no cases from 1950 till like 1970s or early 1980s. But from there on, there has been a sustained increase in the global weed resistant cases. So this graph also shows the number of wheat populations that are resistant to multiple herbicides, which is if a plant species or if a wheat species is resistant to two or more than two herbicides. And these graphs represents the herbicide that is applied. So the top graph represents the herbicide applied in pounds per acre, and the bottom graph represents the total herbicide that is applied over the years from 1960 to 2008. If you can see, the herbicide applied has increased from 1960s to almost around 1980s, and from there on, it kind of plateaued around 1.5 to 2 pounds of herbicide per acre. Even this graph goes hand in hand with the other, with the top graph, uh, with changes in uh, the land acreage, in the total land acreage. So that's that. And here is the graph representing the total pesticide expenditure in $1,000,000. So one of the important things to remember here is, even though the herbicide application has plateaued between around 300 to 400 million pounds, the cost of the herbicide has kept on increasing even after 1980s. So here are some of the uh, uh, economic and management strategies, some of the policy aspects, and the mental model that we have put together based on the discussions that we had when we were coming up through the model. Dynamic hypothesis. So we have put together our dynamic hypothesis, and I'll be explaining this in a step-by-step way, on a point-by-point basis. So the farmers depend on herbicides due to their low cost, ease of use, and efficiency in controlling the problematic weeds. So some of the weeds have grown resistance to the applied herbicides due to a few resistant weed traits that have survived and are passed down to the offspring due to selection pressure. So weeds developing resistance to herbicide challenges crop production and the quality goals of the farmers. So producers and chemical companies have answered this by switching between the existing chemical varieties and investing in crop genetics that make marketable crops resistant to the existing herbicides. However, this is a short-term solution to the problem, but in the long term, the problem is reinforced due to the wheat seed bank accumulation and rising of production costs that erode farm profit potential. This creates a stress on the farmer, both from production and economic perspectives, incentivizing still greater efforts to curtail problematic weeds. This has resulted in greater on-farm chemical use over large cropping systems, thus reinforcing the effects on production, profitability, and farmer stress. So to kind of sum it up, so the farmers use herbicides because of their benefits, but once they start using it over time, some of the weeds develop resistance and pass it down to the offsprings, which is a problem because it kind of challenges the crop production and also the quality of the crop. So the producers and chemical companies answered this by switching between the chemistries, which is a short-term solution, but in a long term, because of the more wheat seed bank accumulation and the raising of the production costs, puts economic and production stress on the farmer, which makes him to use more and more chemicals on the farm. So that's our dynamic hypothesis in brief. And now I'll hand over the presentation to Chris to discuss about the model and the results section.
Thank you, Shri. So over here, we're going to break up this model piece by piece, but we're going to start off by talking about crop biomass. And what goes into crop biomass is once the seeds are planted into the ground and they develop and they grow, it's going to continue to add on to that crop biomass. And the results of that crop biomass for the harvest are going to go directly into the revenue, which is a function of whatever the crop price is at the time. And whatever is just lost out of the system. Now, of course, the revenue is going to go directly into farm profit, and the change in farm profit from season to season is then going to put pressure on the farmer to make a decision about whether or not he should apply more herbicide in his field. Now, of course, the herbicide costs money, so that's going to add to the total production expenses for the farmer, thus completing our reinforcing loop, because the total amount of expenses added is going to put more pressure on the farmer, thus he's going to apply more herbicide. Now, the herbicide in itself can go to one of three places. It can run off, it can degrade, or what we're more concerned about right now is the contact between the herbicide and the plant. Now, whatever the herbicide contacts with is going to kill a proportional amount of the plants in the field, and that's going to create a balancing loop. Now, whatever plants are still on the field are going to develop that resistance that Tree was talking about, and over a period of time, the fractions of weeds remaining with resistance is going to lead into further weed growth, which is going to expand the weed biomass. Now, the balancing loop that we have up here is, as Tree was talking about, the farmer's decision to switch chemicals. As soon as the farmer notices that there is a low effective kill rate on his field, he is going to induce a change on his field, and he's going to switch his chemistry. He's going to switch the herbicide that he is using. Now, based off the model, plugging in realistic numbers into the model, we got some certain results. I should note that these results are taking into account with no switch. So the farmer is not switching chemicals with the graphs that we're about to show you. Now, from what we can see is that for the first few years, we see that the weed biomass is growing, and then it starts to level or plateau off at around year 5, thus creating a negative change in profit for the farmer because of the increased competition due to the increase of the weed biomass. However, after around year 5 or 6, we see that the application rate is also generally steady, and we can note that the fractions of weed remaining with resistance is also plateauing off. It's generally steady, regardless of the fact that the farmer is using more inputs, relatively speaking, than these former years. And of course, these inputs right here are also going to have and are also going to be taken into account whenever we're looking at his overall profit. Now, the results that I'm about to show you right now takes into account a switch, a chemical switch, once the farmer reaches a certain threshold of the effective kill rate. So for the most part, the weed biomass for both the base case, which are these set of graphs I showed you before, and the chemical switch, they're the same for the first 6 years up until time 79, where we see a dramatic decrease. However, some years the weed biomass actually peaks off and is greater than the base case. Now, of course, that's going to have a more dramatic effect on profit, and it's going to be much more dynamic in nature, because some years there's going to be very low weeds, very low competition. Therefore, there's going to be a greater amount of profit. Some years is going to peak off, so there's going to be less profit. And because of this dynamic change, we're also going to see a change in the application rate of how much herbicide that the farmer is going to spray on his field. Now, what's interesting about this is that for the most part, the fractions of weeds remaining with resistance, while some years it's the same, it seems to be in general greater with the chemical switch than we saw during the base case. And it could just be composed down to the dynamics of everything that's going on throughout the model. But I'm now going to switch you off to Reed unless he has anything to add to.
So thank you, Chris, for breaking down the model and explaining the results. So now we talked about what is herbicide resistance and what are all the things that are going into the model. And Chris has explained about the results. So now, how is this herbicide resistance reinforced? How is it like reinforcing itself? So in order to answer this, we have a fixes that backfire archetype, in which you'll be having you'll be having an initial weed pressure, because of which the farmer or the producer increases the rate of herbicide use, which reduces the weed pressure in the short term, closing the top loop or making it like a balancing loop. But in the long run, because of the increased rate of herbicide or because of the other things that are going on, uh, the selection pressure for the weeds, for the resistant weed varieties increases, which increases the fraction of weed seed bank expressing the resistant traits. And they will be there for a little bit with a delay, but with a delay, the wheat population resistant to herbicide eventually increases, which reinforces our problem of wheat pressure that we had in the beginning. So that's the conclusion that we had or the overall picture that we had from the model. And we would like to acknowledge Guadalupe and Eric, who has helped us in the beginning of this project. And we would also like to thank Dr. Josh, who had made great inputs towards our dynamic hypothesis. And we thank you all for your attention. And you guys have any questions?